There was a baby in a high chair, 11 months old, buckled in, crying. No one had come back for her. On the kitchen counter, a half-filled cleaning bucket. On the floor near the door, a coat. And beside the car, still parked in the driveway, a pair of shoes that had never made it out of the house. Everything Cindy Wanner owned was still there. Cindy was not. It was November 25th, 1991, Granite Bay, California, a Tuesday. The day that starts as an ordinary errand and ends as the last day of everything. Cindy was 35 years old. She had driven to her sister's house to clean it. She had brought her youngest daughter with her, 11 months old, because that is what mothers do on ordinary Tuesdays. At some point that morning, someone came through that door. Cindy's husband arrived later with their 4-year-old. He found the baby in the high chair, buckled and crying and alone. He found the coat. He found the shoes. He called out for Cindy, and no one answered.
Walked in, saw the baby crying, and said, "Where's my wife?" And we haven't seen her since.
The police searched for 3 weeks. When they found her, she was 40 miles away in the woods near the Tahoe National Forest. She had been kept alive for days after she was taken, and then she was not. The man who did it walked through a courthouse twice in the years that followed and disappeared under a different name. He was living in Arizona when they found him. This is how a system that failed Cindy Wanner for 34 years finally had to answer for it, and why the thing that caught him was the last tool anyone expected to use. Cindy Wanner was born Cynthia Ann Wanner in Sacramento, California. She grew up in Rancho Cordova, a working-class suburb east of the city where neighbors knew each other by name and kids played in the street until the streetlights came on. She was the kind of person who stayed close to the people she loved. She did not chase distance. She built a life near the people who mattered to her, in the city where she was raised, in the neighborhoods that felt like home. By 1991, she was 35 years old, married, and the mother of 2 daughters. One was 4 years old, the other had just turned 11 months. The life Cindy had built was not spectacular in the way that makes headlines. It was the kind of life that makes a family, ordinary, warm, and full of the small decisions that add up to something real. She was the type of person her family could call for anything. The one who showed up, the one who did the thing that needed doing without being asked twice, which is exactly why she was in Granite Bay that Tuesday. Her sister needed the house cleaned. Cindy said she would do it. She loaded her 11-month-old into the car and drove over. She buckled the baby into the high chair so she could work without watching the floor. She pulled out the cleaning supplies. She was being a good sister. On a Tuesday, in November. That is the last ordinary thing Cindy Wanner did. When Cindy's husband arrived at the house that afternoon with their 4-year-old, the front door was unlocked. The house was quiet except for the baby. He called Cindy's name. Nothing came back. He walked through the rooms. Everything was where it should have been except Cindy. Her coat was inside. Her shoes were inside. Her car was in the driveway. Her purse was still there. Not a single thing that belonged to Cindy Wanner had left that house, except Cindy. He called the police. They arrived and began canvassing the neighborhood. No one had seen anything. No one had heard anything. The house showed no signs of struggle. The front door had been locked when whoever took her walked out. It was as if Cindy had simply ceased to exist in the space between one moment and the next. What investigators established in those first hours was this. Someone had come into that house. Someone had taken Cindy Wanner out of it without leaving any visible trace of how it happened. And that someone had done it while an 11-month-old sat buckled in a high chair 15 feet away. The search lasted 3 weeks. In early December 1991, a hunter moving through a wooded area near Forest Hill, California, in the foothills of the Sierra Nevada, roughly 40 miles northeast of Granite Bay, found a body. Placer County investigators responded. The victim was Cindy Wanner. The forensic examination established that Cindy had not died immediately after being taken. Pathologists concluded she had been kept alive for a period of days before she was killed. She had been sexually assaulted. She had been strangled. And then her body had been left in the trees where, if not for a hunter moving through in December, it might not have been found for months. Cindy's daughters were 4 years old and 11 months old when their mother was murdered. The investigation that followed would span 3.5 decades. It would involve evidence submitted for testing so many times that investigators lost count. It would involve 2 separate arrests of her killer for unrelated crimes, both times letting him walk. It would involve a man who erased his own name from public record and built a new life under someone else's. And it would end, 34 years later, with a photograph on a driver's license. But that part comes later in this video. In the weeks immediately following Cindy's murder, Placer County investigators worked the case with everything they had. They collected biological evidence from the crime scene. They processed it. They submitted it for forensic testing. In 1991, the technology available to work that evidence was limited. The results came back inconclusive. The evidence was logged and stored. The investigation continued without a physical match to point them toward a suspect. What they did not know, what no one could have known, was that the answer was already in storage. The name of the man who killed Cindy Wanner was already in that evidence, sitting in a container in a forensic lab, waiting. The technology to read it did not yet exist. That would change, but not for a very long time. In the months following Cindy's murder, detectives worked suspects, canvassed again, followed leads that opened and closed. The case did not go cold in the dramatic sense. It was never fully set aside. But as 1991 became 1992 and then 1993 and then the years began stacking in the way they do when a case has no name to anchor it, the investigation became what investigators call a cold case, still open, still on file, but without the energy of fresh leads and fresh pressure to move it forward. Cindy's daughters grew up. They grew up without knowing who had taken their mother. They grew up with a case file that stayed open and an answer that stayed locked in a storage container in a forensic lab. The baby in the high chair was 11 months old in November 1991. She was 34 years old when his name was finally said out loud. Before Cindy Wanner was murdered, James Lawhead Jr. had already told the system exactly what he was. Not in words. In the psychiatric record the state of California created in 1980 when he was 20 years old and standing in front of a court after breaking into a home, attacking a 71-year-old grandmother, and raping her 11-year-old granddaughter. The evaluating psychiatrist wrote it in the clinical language courts use for documents that are supposed to matter. James Lawhead Jr. was a mentally disordered sex offender. He was not amenable to treatment. That sentence, not amenable to treatment, is not a minor notation. It is a psychiatric conclusion that carries a specific legal weight. It means the evaluating professional reviewed the subject and determined that the available therapeutic interventions were unlikely to reduce the risk he posed. It means the system's own expert looked at James Lawhead Jr. and said, "This person will not get better." The state of California sentenced him to 19 years. He served 11. In early 1991, James Lawhead Jr. walked out of a California prison at the age of 30. The psychiatric evaluation that had classified him as not amenable to treatment was still in his file. It had not been revised. It had not been reconsidered. He was released because his sentence, reduced for good behavior, had run its term. 10 months later, Cindy Wanner was murdered. Placer County Sheriff Wayne Wu stood at a press conference in April 2026 and said what the record had already made plain. When he was sentenced, psychiatrists from the state classified him as a mentally disordered sex offender who was not amenable to treatment. Yet he was still released after 11 years and kidnapped and murdered Cindy Wanner within a year of his release. Then he said the part that is harder to hear. The justice system here in California is broken. It is probably more broken than it was then. He was not editorializing. He was reading from 3 decades of documented consequence. What the system did not know in 1991, and what investigators would not establish for years, was that James Lawhead Jr. was the man who had walked through that door in Granite Bay. His DNA was in the biological evidence collected from the crime scene. His name was in storage with it, but without a match to pull it forward, the investigation had no way to connect the evidence to the man. And the man, for the time being, was free. He registered as a sex offender, as required by California law. For several years, he remained in the system's visibility. Then, in 2002, he stopped registering. This is the near miss that the case record does not advertise, but cannot conceal. In 2002, James Lawhead Jr. was arrested in Placer County, the same county where Cindy Wanner was murdered for failing to register as a sex offender. He was the man whose DNA sat in storage in connection with one of the most high-profile unsolved murders in the county's history. He was brought in on a compliance charge. His name was in the system. His prior conviction was in the system. The Cindy Wanner case was still open. No one connected them. He moved through the system on the failure to register charge and was released. 3 years later, in 2005, he was arrested again, this time in the city of Lincoln, California, 30 miles from Granite Bay, on an outstanding weapons charge. Same man, same county. Same open case file, and the same building where investigators were still, periodically, reviewing the Cindy Wanner murder. He moved through the system again. After the 2005 arrest, James Lawhead Jr. made a decision. He stopped being James Lawhead Jr. He chose a new name, Vincent Reynolds. He stopped filing paperwork under his legal identity. He stopped appearing in any database that a law enforcement search would naturally reach. He moved. And then he settled somewhere no one who knew his real name would think to look. The Placer County Sheriff's Office would later say, with the careful understatement of people describing something catastrophic, that following the 2005 arrest, he appeared to have vanished, with no documented record of him since 2005. Vanished. After 2 arrests in Placer County, after a psychiatric record that had used the exact words not amenable to treatment, after a biological evidence sample sitting in storage that already had his answer in it. The investigation did not go dormant. Detectives assigned to the cold case unit continued submitting the biological evidence for testing as new technologies emerged. Year by year, the techniques improved. Year by year, the lab would analyze the sample and return a result. Year by year, the result fell just short of the threshold that would produce a usable name. Cindy's daughters had birthdays. They graduated from school. They built lives. The baby in the high chair learned to walk, learned to talk, learned her mother's name from photographs and stories. The samples sat in storage. And James Lawhead Jr., now Vincent Reynolds, sat in a house in Bullhead City, Arizona, in a home registered in his sister's name, 600 miles from Placer County, with loaded firearms staged in multiple rooms, and $15,000 in cash in a bag near the door. He was not hiding in the way people imagine fugitives hide. He was not living off the grid in the wilderness. He was living in a suburb. He had neighbors. He had a registered vehicle. He had a driver's license photograph on file with the Arizona Department of Transportation. That photograph was the mistake he did not know he had made. Not yet. James Lawhead Jr. was 30 years old in November 1991. He had been out of prison for 10 months. He had a prior conviction for crimes against an elderly woman and a child. He was registered as a sex offender. He was documented. He was known. None of that stopped him. What investigators have been able to reconstruct about the day of November 25, 1991, begins with the absence of forced entry and ends with the absence of Cindy Wanner. The house was not broken into. There was no struggle visible in the rooms. The baby in the high chair was not harmed. What happened in that kitchen happened quickly and quietly enough that a child 11 months old sitting 15 feet away registered nothing that left a mark. At some point after Cindy's husband had left that morning and before he returned that afternoon, someone opened the front door and walked in. Someone Cindy either allowed to enter or did not have time to refuse. Someone who knew that the house would not be empty but chose to go through that door anyway. What followed, pathologists concluded, was not immediate. Cindy Wanner was not killed in Granite Bay. She was taken from Granite Bay and held for a period of days. She was kept alive while her husband called police, while her daughters were placed with family. While the search began, the man who took her knew all of this was happening and made no move to stop it. He drove 40 miles into the Sierra Nevada foothills. He left her in the trees near Forest Hill, and he drove back. In December 1991, 2 days after the murder, investigators found a shell casing in the area near where Cindy's body was recovered. It was logged as evidence. It would sit alongside the biological samples for decades. What the investigation could not establish, because the technology did not exist to establish it, was whose DNA was in the biological evidence recovered from the crime scene. Detectives submitted the samples. The results came back below the threshold needed to generate a name. The samples went back into storage. James Lawhead Jr. continued registering as a sex offender as required. He lived within the system's line of sight for 11 years after Cindy's murder. He went to work. He existed in the way that people who have done terrible things sometimes exist quietly, ordinarily, in plain view of the apparatus that was never quite looking at him. Then, in 2002, the failure to register arrest. Then, in 2005, the weapons charge. And then, the decision. He became Vincent Reynolds. It was not a sophisticated disappearance. He did not flee to another country. He did not surgically alter his appearance. He drove to Arizona and filed paperwork under a different name. He registered a vehicle. He rented a house, or rather, he moved into a house owned by his sister, Terry Lawhead, who lived in San Clemente, California, and who, when contacted by Placer County investigators over the years, told them she had not heard from her brother in more than 20 years. The house in Bullhead City, Arizona, was owned by Terry Lawhead. When investigators later searched it, they found her brother living in it. They found loaded firearms staged throughout the rooms, not stored. Staged, meaning positioned for rapid access in multiple locations. They found a bag near the door packed with clothing, $15,000 in cash, and a burner phone. He was not relaxed. He was ready. For 21 years, he had been ready. During those 21 years, Placer County cold case investigators continued working. The evidence came in and out of the lab as new technologies emerged. In 2021, a new generation of advanced DNA analysis became available to regional forensic labs. It was more sensitive than anything that had existed before, capable of extracting a usable profile from biological samples that had previously returned inconclusive results. Detectives pulled the Cindy Wanner evidence from storage one more time. They submitted it to the Contra Costa County Sheriff's Office Forensic Lab. The lab ran the analysis. This time, it came back. The sample returned a name: James Lawhead Jr., the man who had registered as a sex offender in Placer County. The man who had been arrested in Placer County in 2002 and again in 2005. The man who, in the words of the official case file, had appeared to have vanished with no documented record since 2005. The DNA found him, but DNA cannot find an address. Finding where James Lawhead Jr. had gone required something else entirely. The Placer County Cold Case Unit knew who they were looking for. What they did not know was where he was. The name James Lawhead Jr. returned nothing current in law enforcement databases. No address. No employment record, no utility registration, no tax filing. The official description was precise. No documented record since 2005. 21 years of a man who had made himself invisible to every system built to track people like him. Sex offender registries, federal databases, state criminal records. He was in all of them for crimes committed before 2005. After 2005, the trail ended. Detectives began working the edges of the picture. They knew about the prior arrests. They knew the counties. They pulled records from family members. They reached out to law enforcement agencies in regions where they believed he might have migrated the Pacific Northwest, the Southwest. They built a theory. A man trying to disappear would need a new name, a new vehicle registration, and a fixed address. He could not vanish entirely. He had to exist somewhere on paper. They were looking for Vincent Reynolds. They did not yet know that name, but they were looking for whoever James Lawhead Jr. had become. In April 2026, Placer County detectives reached out to the Scottsdale Police Department in Arizona with a specific request. They had reason to believe their suspect might be in the Bullhead City area. Bullhead City sits in northwestern Arizona on the Colorado River, near the Nevada border, the kind of town where a person can exist without attracting much attention. They needed a set of eyes in the state's motor vehicle database. They needed to know if any photographs on file matched the booking photos they had for James Lawhead Jr. On April 21, 2026, a senior crime analyst at the Scottsdale Police Department received the request. Her name has not been made public. What she does publicly is unremarkable. She analyzes cases, runs database queries, processes information requests from other agencies. The tool she used, Arizona's Motor Vehicle Department Facial Recognition System, exists to catch people who apply for driver's licenses under false names. It is built to flag fake IDs. It is the kind of technology deployed at DMV counters to catch college students who want to drink before they are old enough. It is not, in any formal sense, a fugitive hunting apparatus. On April 22, she submitted a request to the Arizona Department of Transportation. She asked for photographs associated with the name Vincent Reynolds, Bullhead City, Arizona. On April 23, the Arizona Department of Transportation returned the photos. She ran the facial recognition comparison. The algorithm measured the geometry of the face in the motor vehicle photograph against the geometry of the face in the California booking photos for James Lawhead Jr. It came back as a match. Vincent Reynolds was James Lawhead Jr. The analyst also ran a license plate reader check, a Euro, using flock camera data from the Bullhead City area to confirm a vehicle registered to Vincent Reynolds was active and present in the region. It was. The vehicle was there. The man was there. She shared her findings with the lead Placer County detective on April 24. The Placer County detective coordinated with the Bullhead City Police Department. On the morning of April 24, 2026, officers approached a house in Bullhead City, Arizona. James Lawhead Jr. Vincent Reynolds was on the driveway when they arrived. He was 64 years old. He had been living as Vincent Reynolds for 21 years. For 34 years, the name James Lawhead Jr. had been attached to an open murder case in a county he had driven through twice in handcuffs and twice walked away from. He was taken into custody without incident. Placer County detectives flew to Arizona immediately. They executed a search warrant on the house. What they found inside told its own story. Multiple loaded firearms, positioned in multiple rooms, not locked away, not stored, staged. A bag near the door with a change of clothes. $15,000 in cash. A burner phone. A man who had spent 21 years sleeping with one eye open. James Lawhead Jr. was booked into the Mojave County Jail. He was charged with murder, kidnapping, and being a wanted sex offender. The charges from Placer County included the murder of Cindy Wanner with special circumstances, murder in the commission of a rape, and murder in the commission of a kidnapping. The next day, April 25, investigators moved to a home in San Clemente, California. They were looking for Terry Lawhead, James Lawhead Jr.'s 71-year-old sister. She had been contacted by Placer County investigators multiple times over the years. Each time, she had told them the same thing. She had not heard from her brother in more than 20 years. The house in Bullhead City, where James Lawhead Jr. had been living for years, was owned by Terry Lawhead. Phone records and other evidence would establish that the two had remained in regular contact throughout the years she was telling investigators she knew nothing. Terry Lawhead was arrested in Lancaster County, South Carolina, where she had been staying. She was charged as an accessory. The house her brother had been living in was searched. Her home in San Clemente was searched the following day. At a press conference on April 27, 2026, Placer County District Attorney Morgan Geyer stood at the podium and addressed what 34 years had amounted to. This family has suffered in anguish for 35 years. They deserve some accountability. Then, this arrest is a powerful reminder that time does not erase responsibility, and it does not diminish our commitment. 6 sentences across 2 statements, each one true, none of them large enough to contain what had actually happened. James Lawhead Jr. was caught by a DMV database in Arizona, a system built to catch fake IDs after 34 years, 2 courthouse appearances, and 21 years under a stolen name. If this story is worth sharing, hit that like button and subscribe. It means this channel keeps going. And there is one more thing you need to know about this case, the part that changes how you understand everything you just heard. Here is what the press conference on April 27, 2026 established, in the order it was established. James Lawhead Jr. had been identified by DNA. He had been located by facial recognition. He had been arrested in Arizona. He was alive, in custody, facing charges. That is the story the viewer has spent this entire video understanding. The investigation, the failures, the evidence and storage, the lab that finally returned a name, the analyst who matched the face to the photo. That is the framework. And it is not wrong, but it is not the whole story. Here is the part that arrives quietly. The biological evidence that identified James Lawhead Jr. was collected in 1991. It came from the crime scene. It was logged and stored by investigators who were doing their jobs with the technology available to them at the time. It went into the Contra Costa County lab in 2021 as one of many items from the case that had been submitted and resubmitted across 3 decades. But the technology to read that evidence to generate a usable DNA profile from that biological sample had existed since approximately 2003. The analysis technique that identified James Lawhead Jr. was not new. It was an advanced version of a technique that had existed for 20 years. Placer County detectives submitted the sample and got a result in 2021 because the lab's instrumentation had been upgraded and the analysis had become more sensitive. But a version of that analysis, capable of returning the same name, had been available to forensic labs for roughly 18 years before it was run on Cindy Wanner's case. That is not a dramatic revelation in the way a courtroom confession is dramatic. It arrives without music. It arrives without a visible moment of consequence. It is simply a fact embedded in the timeline of forensic science, a timeline that the press conferences did not read aloud and that the news coverage did not pause to examine. 18 years. During those 18 years, Cindy's youngest daughter, the baby in the high chair, a Euro, graduated from high school, graduated from wherever she went after that, built whatever life she built, spent her entire adolescence and the beginning of her adult life not knowing who had taken her mother out of that kitchen. During those 18 years, James Lawhead Jr. was arrested twice in Placer County and walked away twice. During those 18 years, he became Vincent Reynolds and drove to Arizona and staged loaded firearms in the rooms of his sister's house and slept next to $15,000 in cash and kept a burner phone in case he needed to disappear again. During those 18 years, the evidence sat. Sheriff Wayne Wu said it plainly at the press conference, in language that named the thing without flinching. The justice system here in California is broken. It is probably more broken than it was then. He was right. He was right in 1991 when the system released a man whose own psychiatric file said he should not be released. He was right in 2002 when that same man was arrested in the county where he had committed murder and walked away on a registration charge. He was right in 2005, and he was right about the 18 years during which an answer sat in storage that no one reached for. This case was not solved by technology in 2026. The answer was produced in 1991 by Cindy Wanner. By whatever happened in that kitchen that left biological evidence the system could eventually read, she did not survive what happened to her. But something of what happened to her was preserved, collected, stored, waiting. What happened in 2026 was that someone finally looked at that evidence with the right tool. What happened in the 72 hours between April 21 and April 24 was that someone used a driver's license database to find a face that a forensic lab had already given them a name for. The technology did not solve this case. Cindy Wanner left the evidence that solved this case. The world took 34 years to use it. On April 27, 2026, Placer County Sheriff Wayne Wu addressed the family at the press conference. We've never given up pursuing justice for Cindy and her family. We hope this is a small step in the healing process. A small step. 34 years and a small step. Cindy's daughters were in the world when those words were spoken. The baby from the high chair was 34 years old. She had grown up without her mother. She had lived with a case file that stayed open and an answer that stayed locked and a man who walked through a Placer County courthouse twice and went back to Arizona and slept next to $15,000 waiting to run. She heard his name said out loud for the first time in April 2026. She was 11 months old when it happened. She deserved to hear it sooner. Return to the beginning. Return to the high chair. Return to the coat and the shoes and the car still in the driveway. James Lawhead Jr. erased himself from every database built to find him. He did not erase himself from the one that was never looking. Cindy Wanner's baby is 34 years old now. She deserved to know. Thanks for watching, and don't forget to subscribe for more valuable videos. See you in the next one.